Thanks for that. We move to our final speaker, who is Professor Elisa Morgera, who's Professor of Global Environment Law at the University of Strathclyde. And she is going to be talking, she's Professor of Global Environmental Law and the Director of the UKRI GCRF One Ocean Hub. She's a member of the Strathclyde Centre for Environmental Law and Governance, and she specialises in international, European and comparative environmental law, with a particular focus on the interactions between biodiversity law and human rights, equity and sustainability in natural resource development, oceans governance, and corporate accountability. Elisa has also researched the environmental dimensions of the external relations of the European Union. Elisa, if you'd like to put your presentation up, and you're going to be talking about the challenges of creating a regulatory framework for ocean biodiversity. I'll hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And it's really a pleasure and in a good way, a daunting task to follow the previous two presenters who have just incredibly illustrated the value of biodiversity and how little we may know about how much we depend on that marine biodiversity. So what I'll share with you in my short presentation is where we are at internationally in recognizing those values and in protecting marine biodiversity for all these different purposes. And in fact, showing the current challenges, which some of you have already alluded to, how we're lagging behind in that recognition and what we need to do as researchers to contribute to a more joined up international regulatory framework to protect marine biodiversity. And I think among lawyers, we're quite familiar with the idea that the main challenge in the international regulatory framework is fragmentation. And many of you may be familiar with this phenomenon also at the national level. We know that the oceans and fisheries are regulated separately from coastal tourism, from freshwaters, from forestry, for instance, and that in itself is a challenge in protecting ecosystems and their interactions. Now, that is also true at the international level. And when we have multiple international treaties that protect biodiversity, including marine biodiversity, and that's the case of the Convention on Biological Diversity, but also earlier treaties that have to do with migratory species and marine species in international trade, for instance. We have a separate family of international treaties that have to do with the sea and the law of the sea. They don't speak specifically about biodiversity, but they do have general rules on the protection of the marine environment. And more we understand how we need to interpret and apply the rules on the law of the sea with the rules on biodiversity. But we also realize that those current rules we have are not clear enough. And for instance, we have negotiations at the moment at the United Nations to develop a new international agreement that can clarify what are the international obligations of states to protect marine biodiversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction. So that's in the high seas and in the area, the international seabed. But of course, as we were saying, there's many other international instruments and processes that have to do, for instance, with fisheries. And we just heard how overfishing is a major threat to marine biodiversity and the role of the ocean to also mitigate climate change. So we have separate international and regional processes that have to do with fisheries, and they're starting to address specific biodiversity issues, but I would say that the global consensus is that they're not doing enough yet. And of course, climate change would be another arena where we would think that the amazing science that my colleagues have just shared would be very central. And in fact, it's only been last week, in fact, a day ago, that we had the first recognition, official recognitions within the international climate change regime, that we need to integrate ocean-based action in the work, high level, but also national and local level work on climate change mitigation and adaptation. The science is already ahead, but in terms of international regulation, which in turn influences, for instance, international financial flows, this is our first acknowledgement. And yes, around the climate COP in Glasgow, there were a lot of discussions around the ocean and the science, but there's still so much work to be done. And I think one good example is ecosystem restoration, and exactly what Stephen was saying around our understanding of coastal, the importance of coastal marine biodiversity as opposed to oceanic biodiversity for climate change mitigation, and how important are our efforts to restore already degraded oceanic environments as opposed to also coastal environments, with a view to then contributing to climate mitigation as well as adaptation. And in an event, for instance, on the UN Decade for Ecosystem Restoration, which is right now, and it happens in parallel with the UN Decade for Ocean Science, we were assessing with different UN bodies that we haven't done enough to really put center stage ocean and ocean ecosystems as part of ecosystem restoration. We have a lot of evidence and learning from terrestrial and maybe coastal, but not nearly enough about ocean ecosystem restoration. And what are the gaps in science? How do we need to address those barriers also from the perspective of the action on ocean science that we need? Linked to that, I think an important piece in understanding the international regulatory framework is human rights. And that is a key connection that I'm working together with other colleagues to really show that an understanding of natural capital of ecosystem services is not something that's already sanctioned and protected by our environmental laws from the international to the national level, but more and more we understand that those benefits for humanities are actually already legally protected internationally through governments' obligations under international human rights law, including to protect the rights of children whose lives are and will be affected by our failure or successes to protect marine biodiversity. And human rights also provide us additional tools for putting pressure, for understanding needed legal backing to the scientific findings that we've heard today. I just want to give another quick examples to show how complex and how much work we need to do in terms of joining up the international regulatory framework. So the example of ocean plastics is a really interesting one. The Convention on Biological Diversity has addressed it to some extent, as it has brought together the questions of climate change and protection and restoration of marine biodiversity. But for instance, I wonder how many people are aware that action on climate change is also relevant for ocean plastics, that if we get more ambitious commitments to reduce fossil fuel production, that will also affect plastic production, which leads to ocean plastics down the line. But even more importantly, also the fact that ocean plastic itself is negatively impacting on marine biodiversity and its capacity to mitigate climate change. But there are other places where ocean plastics are discussed. And these are, for instance, the Chemicals International Treaty. So this is a whole new nexus that we need to fully explore to make sure that internationally we are addressing these issues in the interconnected way we need. And once again, we have potentially a new treaty that will be discussed in Nairobi at the UN Environment Programme on the life cycle of plastics, which will be relevant for protecting marine biodiversity as well. But I think what has been really interesting, and this is news, oops, sorry, I think there's something missing there. In terms of where we find opportunities is that, again, in the human rights framework, we may have an understanding of where the protection of marine biodiversity is essentially linked to our essential human needs and human needs that are already internationally protected under separate treaties. And so for all of you who are interested in ocean plastics, for instance, I recommend reading the 2021 report by the UN Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights, who really points to the false solutions to ocean plastics, to the question like how recycling plastics is only happening in 9% of times, and how we need to look at other solutions and increase efforts, not just take for granted that recycling plastic is a solution. We need to reduce plastic production. And that, he said, bringing together the science from the marine biodiversity point, from other disciplines, the chemicals, and reading it in a human rights perspective. And that, I think, is really helpful for us to see how we need to bring that legal framework together and find opportunities across different processes. So with that, I will just then say, well, what is our role as researchers to help that process? And not only to bring the scientific evidence that I think my colleagues have explained just earlier on, but really thinking about how our research process itself might need to change for it to be more effective in supporting integrated ocean governance. And this has very much to do with transdisciplinarity, with connecting, first of all, across the marine sciences. Often we may look at fisheries science and deep sea ecology, and they might not necessarily, all the findings may not quite match up once we get to the stage of making decisions, understanding trade-offs, and fully valuing marine biodiversity resources, their functioning, and understanding the implications of our courses of action. But even more crucially, bringing in the social sciences to really having that understanding of how as humans we benefit or we are negatively impacted by our choices on marine biodiversity protection or uses of the oceans that may be negatively impacting on marine biodiversity. And once again, I think what's really been helpful, at least in the work under the One Ocean Hub, is saying, backing this up, this understanding with both the ecosystem services, the natural capital approach, and the law, bringing in how we understand the international environmental law and international human rights law are mutually supportive. And you can use them to give legal backing to those scientific findings that the colleagues have explained earlier on. And really to show to governments that they're already expected to take those findings into account. They're already obliged to achieve those objectives, and the science is really showing how to do so. And I think in that sense, it is really important that as researchers, not only we work much more across disciplines, really finding where we can help each other to make the change that on our own we haven't been able to do, but how we work with others outside academia and invite others becoming co-researchers with us and bring in their own experiential knowledge from different sectors, such as the fisheries sectors or tourism, but crucially, indigenous peoples, knowledge holders and local knowledge holders, children, women, others that will have an understanding, a lived experience of what degraded marine biodiversity has meant for their lives and who may have solutions. And working with them through also arts-based approaches and others to bring that variety of views and notions together and offering a much more integrated evidence base to decision makers from the national to the international level. So if we want the decisions to be integrated, I think as researchers, we also need to find and develop new ways for us to develop the evidence in a more integrated base, which already speaks both to the multiple values of biodiversity and also to the lived experiences and the understanding of those who are immediately affected by those impacts on marine biodiversity. So I'll stop there, and just to wrap up saying that I think transdisciplinary ocean research, how we can advance that, is crucial both to show to the international governance level where things are falling short, where the rules are not up to scratch with the science, but also where we don't have adequate processes to have generative conversations around the needs of protection of marine biodiversity, the values to humankind, and the opportunities to look at this as opposed into attention and maybe antagonistic struggles for ocean use and access to ocean spaces in a more generative and productive space for decision making. And equally using the law and particularly human rights and the environment to back our scientific findings from across and really show how those claims that children were very vocal in Glasgow last week, where indigenous peoples were maybe the most, I think, vocal in explaining how much we need urgent action on the ocean and on climate change. Those are legally backed claims. They're not just claims out there. They're already part of what governments have already agreed to do. And hopefully the law can also provide the pathways to make that science and the integrated evidence base into decisions. And finally, think about how we can share the learning across scales, how we bring that understanding from the local level to the international, from the international to the national and local, and really nurture dialogues between the decision makers, people who are impacted by the failures to protect marine biodiversity, scientists and other knowledge holders that can help understand what are the causes, what are the solutions, what are the blind spots. So I'll stop there and hope that with more questions, we can even bring further together the contributions we've made so far. But thank you so much for this opportunity.